Games rarely show relationships. Think about it for a second. How often is a stable romantic relationship really shown in a game? There's plenty of games about relationships, or games where you can be in a relationship, but they almost never properly portray it. Usually you get to non-canonically choose someone in a manner entirely adjacent to the story, with the game adjusting as required. Persona 5's Joker, for example, can be a harem-mongering fuckboy or chased as a saint, and nothing really changes. But even when you do engage in these relationships, what you never see is the moment-to-moment, the two-way interactions that move it from something theoretical to something that feels real. I mean, very often in these games, the player character doesn't speak or visibly interact with anyone beyond passively absorbing their adoration and affection. And a lot of the time that a canonical romantic relationship does exist in a game, it'll either be over in 5 minutes to provide a motivation or its backstory over before the game even began. I'm not sure entirely why games tend to be so uncomfortable with this, but for whatever reason, seeing a properly romantic duo allowed to exist on screen and interact is exceptionally rare. This is the main reason that Haven, a 2020 title from the Game Bakers, is so interesting to me. The entire focus of the game is on the explicitly romantic central relationship between the protagonists, Yu and Kei. More than that though, it's a relationship that's already had years to develop before you even meet them. They're given equal billing too. You can control either or both, they have almost identical amounts of dialogue and screen time, and though they're distinct as characters, they're almost always presented as a unit. It's also made clear how they each have very different yet complementary skills, both of which are vital. Yu's the mechanic, without whom the acquisition, piloting, and ongoing repair of their ship, the Nest, would have been impossible. Meanwhile, Kei, a biologist, uses his skills to feed them and help them understand the strange new world they're stranded on. The new world in question is named Source, a seemingly abandoned planet that the two have fled to while on the run from the Apiary. The Apiary is one of those ambiguous dystopias, a spacefaring civilization where things sound pretty good for most people, but there's no freedom to love who you want. Instead, people are paired by an AI, and though the high success rate and quality of life means people don't tend to mind so much, they're not really given much say in the matter. Yu and Kei are a couple who fell in love before being matched and weren't willing to let each other go, and due to their specific circumstances, skills, and quite a lot of luck, were able to escape. The story, such as it is, follows their attempts to settle on and explore Source, and, after they find evidence of strange corruption and a previous settling attempt, to work out what happened while they salvage parts to repair the Nest. Naturally, things evolve past this to a degree. There is a plot and things happen, but that doesn't mean it's plot-driven. The driving force of the game is less what happens to Yu and Kei, and more just their relationship with each other, and it's portraying that which was clearly the foremost priority. The two banter, debate, argue and flirt, they forage, explore and cook together, and this all occurs across hours worth of unique conversations. Its narrative priorities are expressed in a way very unique to games. Often when we talk about games as a worthwhile storytelling medium, people end up touching on ideas like mechanics as metaphor or ludonarrative synergy. And these definitely are valuable tools that can allow a game to express itself in a way that only a game can. But an underappreciated element of games is how they have more freedom than most other media to consist largely of narratively unimportant moments. Scenes in books, or especially films, have a pressure to be meaningful. Space is limited, so a scene needs a good reason to be there, and what happens between scenes is usually left to implication. But games don't need to do that. Moving from A to B can be engaging due to gameplay, which gives games so much more freedom to show what happens between those moments. These moments between are an area where games can truly thrive. Take The Last of Us, for example. One of its greatest strengths is in how well it paces out Ellie and Joel's relationship. They give it space to breathe, and it grows naturally throughout the course of conversations that take place mostly while you're just moving around. Most of them are far too casual or irrelevant to be worth taking up an entire scene in a film, but there's room for them in a game, which is a pretty good thing too, because without them, The Last of Us wouldn't work anywhere near as well. Sure, the game structures itself around its big moments, but they're given their meaning and context by all the little ones. Though they don't share much else in common, Haven is another game which finds itself in the moments between. There's little urgency most of the time, and the two don't even have to get to know each other. You and Kay are already in a relationship, and don't have much pressure to go anywhere either. Over 90% of the dialogue they have could be cut without the story or even their relationship dynamics really suffering. It's just, well, that's where the crux of the game lies. It puts a large burden on their chemistry. Whether or not you'll like this game will largely come down to whether or not you vibe with the central pair. If you do, any other faults are forgivable, and if you don't, the other strengths of the game are meaningless. So the biggest compliment I can pay the game is that I never really grew bored of watching them interact. They have a chemistry and energy and sincerity that won me over. I just enjoyed spending time with them and watching them enjoy being together. Of course, it's helped a lot by some stellar voice acting and tight writing. Just the way the two speak to each other helps sell the idea that they're in love. Although admittedly the dialogue can at times feel a little, well, written. There's something of a young adulty feel throughout actually, like in how the word fuck is replaced with bloot. It's kinda cute, and if you've ever read a Brandon Sanderson book, it'll probably just wash right over you, but this sort of thing can really bug some people. That said though parts of the writing can feel a little immature on the surface, I don't feel it actually is. In fact, Haven consistently surprised me with how maturely it handles a lot of things. So, games tend to present sex a little problematically. While with relationships they barely even try, with sex they do try, and it can get pretty uncomfortable real fast. There's a long history of games using sex or nudity in a blatantly male-gazy way. Some games present it as a sort of collectible or achievement, or else the subject of pretty uncomfortable or tasteless jokes. The GTA series, for example, is just terrible for this. But when it's not an outright joke, the idea usually seems to be trying for a more mature presentation, but mature in a sort of Game of Thrones without the good writing kind of way. Sort of like sex as a signifier that this is adult and should be taken seriously. The Witcher series engages in this quite a lot. It feels a little better there because there's usually more context. Most of the women Geralt sleeps with are actual characters to some degree, but it's still presented a little weirdly. It's very male power fantasy, what with the player character beset on all sides by women trying to sleep with them. BioWare games try and go for the hey we're mature thing a lot too, but even then it's often presented as a reward for investing time and having made the right dialogue decisions. The absolute worst thing this sort of approach can do though is try to really go for it, and show you these horrible low-res character models awkwardly bumping into each other in a nightmarish parody of ecstasy. It tends to utterly deflate any seriousness. At best it's amusing, at the game's expense, and at worst it's just really uncomfortable. In contrast to its peers though, Haven is quite tasteful in fact. You and Kay flirt a lot, and it's not uncommon for conversations to pretty clearly, or even explicitly, be heading towards sex as it fades to black. But instead of it being used for titillation or humour, it instead serves to make them more convincing as people. The game's not so afraid of the topic that it hides behind ambiguity, but nor is it so pleased with itself for being willing to admit that sex exists that it feels the need to animate it in full, or lean on it for a sense of maturity. It's actually rare in any medium for sex to be presented as something tender and loving and cute, which is honestly a little sad. It was Haven's handling of it that made me realise just how rare it is to see this stuff both present and handled well, and it's something I really appreciated about the game. So we're almost 10 minutes into this video, and I've still not really discussed the whole game part of the game, or how it ties into the bigger picture. Things are set up pretty quickly. Your ship needs new parts, there's weird corruption called rust infecting plants and animals, you guys need food, and there's signs of previous human activity. From there you're let loose into a limited open world to explore, scavenge for items, and stumble across plot. But if the core of the game is the relationship between you and Kay, which it definitely is, then the question is how the gameplay strengthens that, or at least relates to it. And unfortunately the answer is that it mostly doesn't. The game touches on these ideas of freedom and self-determination, but the mechanical systems never give you the opportunity to express yourself through play, or even to express the characters you're playing as. Like, sure, it's nominally an open world, but it's designed to be small and dense enough that you can go in any direction and find something relevant fast, which means you can run up against the edge of the world in minutes. The only way the gameplay really succeeds in relating to the core of the game is in being a vehicle for those moments between we discussed earlier. In that, at least, it's successful. As you float around, the pair comment on things and chat, and the most compelling things you can find in the world are triggers for short conversations or bigger plot elements. And the way you stumble across relevant things in the course of regular play does feel quite naturalistic and well contextualized. It's just that all the actual gameplay feels kinda adjacent. Take the combat, for example, which largely feels like it's there to contextualize other systems. For example, the mechanical justification for the need to find, cook, and eat food is that not doing so makes you less effective in combat. You scavenge plants to turn into medicine, which is used to heal damage that you take in combat, and one of the main tasks in the game is to clean up rust, and as you do, you gather it in a crystallized form. But the only thing you can use it for is to make consumables for combat. And all of this is fine, but it would work a lot better if the combat didn't feel so ultimately meaningless. It's not bad, it's actually quite unique and could be occasionally enjoyable, and I imagine it's even more interesting in co-op. But you can skip most of the fights in the game and miss very little. You're even given a dedicated button to tell nearby enemies to piss off if you're not in the mood. There's a couple of necessary fights, or ones you can't really avoid without knowing about them in advance, but even at their hardest they're very forgiving, and there's nothing like a final boss fight or even any combat at all during the climax. If I had to guess, I'd say things were designed this way so that it'd be easy for someone who games to play this in co-op with a partner who doesn't. And given that combat isn't the main point of the game, that was probably the right call. And it's also true that the game would be poorer without the systems that are propped up by the combat. Without it, there'd be basically nothing to do in the nest, and the conversations that happen after eating are some of the best in the game. The campsites you're encouraged to rest at by these systems also feature some of the more visually beautiful and emotionally touching scenes I remember. So I can't say that the combat shouldn't be in the game at all, but I also can't deny that it was in many ways the most tiresome part of the entire experience for me. The exploration fares a little better, and it's there that I came the closest to feeling the sort of joy and freedom that you and Kay seem to feel. It seems to want to evoke the flow of games like Journey. At its best, drifting around corners, following flow threads, and drinking in the sights, it all really comes together. And the score is just incredible. But there's a number of niggling little irritations that hold it back just a little. You'll often crash into things or the edge of islets, and adjusting can be a pain. And all the stuff you're supposed to float over or pick up means you end up plotting these bizarre twisty routes that the controls and camera aren't well suited for. The loading screens can be frequent, even if they are varied and honestly adorable. And while sometimes following the flow threads feels amazing, at other times you're having to search for the one thread that'll take you where you want to go, and you end up running in circles. Like, in the Game Baker's previous game, Fury, everything flowed so smoothly that it felt like you could draw in a breath at the start of a fight, exhale it at the end, and time might as well have been frozen in between. But in Haven, well, the gameplay isn't bad. In fact, often it's really good. But between all the things that can arrest your momentum, loading screens, combat, cutscenes, or even getting stuck on terrain, it can be hard to get into the groove that the music and game feel seem to want to encourage. It feels like the game could have gone harder in one of several directions. Like, maybe it could have doubled down on the flying, guiding you along more complex aerial flow threads through more rugged and alien terrain. Or the islets could have been larger and more unique, with more rolling terrain and space to get into more of a groove. Like, instead of 40 small islets, there could have been 10 bigger ones. But instead it's this awkward middle ground. They even designed 4 biomes, but used the same starting one for the majority of the game, which flattens the visual variety beyond what was necessary. I'm a little worried that I sound too negative though. I haven't even properly called out the aesthetics of the game, art and music and style altogether. It has part of the same vibrancy that made Fury so electric too. Everything just pops. And I've almost never been more into playing a game before I even hit the menu screen than after watching the absolutely jaw-dropping opening animation. And everything I said about the gameplay might be true, but there's a lot of good in there as well. Like, not just in how it contextualizes everything and is necessary for the game to function. Overall, I did actually enjoy it and found a lot to love. I love the way time passes until you're floating around under alien sunsets and the pair's stomachs begin to rumble. I love how it feels to follow aerial flow threads, and I love how much better I felt at navigating the controls and the movement by the end compared to the start. It was exciting to see something that looked important and make my way towards it to unearth more hints as to the nature of Rust, the previous attempt to settle Source, and why the planet exploded into floating islands. I even enjoyed the minigame of cleaning up the rust on the islets and seeing the map icon turn from red to white. And for that matter, I liked how the map notes are written diegetically from UNK's perspectives in a way that's both cute and kinda makes sense. I might not ever recommend Haven purely on the basis of its gameplay, but I don't want to give the impression that there's nothing good to be found there, because there is. And while we're talking about the good to be found, I really ought to reiterate my praise for the music, composed by French musician Danger. At this point, absolutely banger soundtracks are becoming something of an icon for the game bakers. It's honestly difficult to overstate how integral the music was to my enjoyment of Haven, and how much it smoothed over the irritations I had. Even when the game is resisting your attempts to get lost in it, the music acts as a lubricant, guiding you to the right feel and vibe. The aesthetic of Source matches it all perfectly. Vibrant colours and contrast, the world alive and breathing. Gaming is an experiential medium, something that can't always be captured in analyses of plot points and mechanics, and the game bakers seem to have always understood how to tap into that, and how much music can do to guide that. Ultimately though, for as much as the music enriches the world of Source, for as pretty as it looks and for all the time spent fighting and exploring, none of these are truly the focus of Haven. Rather, the truly important bits are the quiet moments of connection that these will fill the time between. Moments like fashioning a bootleg guitar and playing it under the stars while brainstorming silly band names, or finding an abandoned poster that reminds one of them of a childhood phase, or Kay's excitement at discovering a strange new species. And for all that the game is most interested in its quieter moments, it does build towards a thematically satisfying conclusion. The ultimate question it asks of you and Kay, and by extension the player, is how much is worth sacrificing for love. The two start the game having already sacrificed everything except each other, and the game ends with the decision of whether or not to commit to that. You can, to paraphrase the plot a little bit, either blow up the bridge connecting Source to the apiary, or back out and be captured. Staying together is clearly supposed to be the good choice. It's what the entire game has been leading toward, both narratively and thematically. But it isn't presented without nuance. After all, the lives wouldn't necessarily be bad if they gave up. Their memories would be wiped and they'd be reintegrated into society with their assigned partners. It's just that it wouldn't be the lives they chose, or spent with the people they chose to spend it with, and having that self-determination was obviously important enough that they fled in the first place. But for the ending to successfully be about them reaffirming both their love and their sacrifice, it has to actually be a sacrifice. So it's not glossed over that not only would the alternative be livable for them, but that if they go ahead with the plan, they'd never be able to change their minds, or speak to or even see another human being ever again. They'd be cutting an entire planet off from the rest of the solar system, and placing all of their trust in that their feelings for each other will never change. And I think the gravity with which they treat it and the greyness of the choice gives it a lot more impact. Things are better than they used to be in most parts of the world, but even today people still have to make more or less exactly this choice. Whether it be due to differences in religion or culture or family won't accept someone's sexuality, every day people are forced to choose between their family and their status quo versus being themselves and being with who they love. And I think it'd cheapen the impact there if you and Kay were only trying to sever the bridge because they'd just be killed if they didn't. Because then the choice wouldn't be about whether their love was worth the sacrifice or not. It's a surprisingly welcome bit of weight at the end of a story that, though enjoyable, hadn't really asked any big questions up to then. And it functions both as a more appropriate climax than a boss fight ever could, as well as a real payoff for all the time you spent getting to know the two of them and watching them support each other. Ultimately, Haven is the sort of game where the shortcomings are simply far less interesting than what it does well. Thousands of games have had minor mechanical irritations, or systems which don't cohere quite 100% flawlessly, and they'll continue to do so. But very few games have even tried to tell a love story like this, let alone one with such style and energy and heart. And very few games have managed to make me believe in a relationship quite like this, or care about it. I enjoyed being on Source. I enjoyed its sights and sounds, the alien creatures, the way the pair hold hands as they glide around it, and when the music hit the right notes I could almost imagine I was there. And if that sort of feeling isn't the reason I play games, I don't know what is. In the end, there's plenty Haven could have done better, or differently, but I strongly suspect that those things will have entirely faded from my mind long before I start to forget how much I enjoyed my time with you and Kay.